I'm Julie Walensky, and I'm a principal in the private equity group North America at Investcorp. I've been with the firm for over 7 years, and on behalf of Investcorp, I'd like to welcome everyone from all over the world to today's Global Conversations, which is actually taking place in New York City. Today's topic is America's global role after Afghanistan. We are delighted to have Frances Townsend as our special guest, and I'm especially honored to introduce Frances to everyone listening in. Frances is Executive Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Activision Blizzard and is an Investcorp Advisory Board member. Prior to Activision Blizzard, Frances served as Vice Chairman, General Counsel, and Chief Administrative Officer at McAndrews and Forbes. Prior to that, she was a corporate partner at Baker Botts. From 2004 to 2008, Frances served as the Assistant for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism to President George W. Bush, chairing the Homeland Security Council during a pivotal period for the United States. Frances is on several nonprofit boards, including the Atlantic Council, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Council on Foreign Relations. She also is the co-chair of the Council on Foreign Relations sponsored independent task force on preparing for the next pandemic. Jon Dracos will also be joining us as a moderator for today's session. Jon is the global head of Investcorp's real estate practice and has been with the firm since 1995. Investcorp has grown its real estate practice over the years and currently has over $8 billion of assets under management across properties in the US, Europe, and India. I'll now hand it over to Jon and Frances to discuss US foreign policy in this new environment. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate it. Greetings, everyone. It's great to be here with Frances today, and we have a basic timely topic, America's role after Afghanistan, which is maybe even more topical with the UN in session here in New York. As anybody knows, it's in New York City. So I thought we'd jump right in with some questions, Frances, and get the conversation going. Frances, we commemorated 9/11 a few days ago, which marked 20 years of US occupying Afghanistan. I'm curious to hear, why did the US leave, in your opinion?
Jon, first, thank you for hosting and moderating. Thank you to Investcorp for having me. I really so much enjoy my time sort of with everybody at Investcorp. So, you know, it's almost hard for me to imagine it's been 20 years since 9/11. As folks with children will appreciate, my youngest son was born about 2 weeks before. And so he's a living reminder to me of the passage of time. And if you had asked me 20 years ago, if I thought after all the blood and treasure that the United States had spilled and spent in Afghanistan, that the Taliban would have had a resurgence and be back in control of Afghanistan, I'd have thought it was crazy, frankly. Look, I think that we made an enormous commitment to the people of Afghanistan, put aside our own interests in terms of our own national security and protecting ourselves from another terror attack. We made commitments to Afghanistan, its people, our allies. And I think if I was a Gold Star mother and saw this withdrawal, I'd be heartbroken. We've kept troops in Germany, in Japan, in Korea, larger forces than we had in Afghanistan, which we had drawn down to 2,500. And so in my judgment, I would not have left. I would have stayed. It would have enabled the contractors, our diplomats, and our partners in Afghanistan to remain while we continued to sort of support Afghan forces. I think President Biden decided it was time to leave. You know, Afghanistan has been called now our longest war. And there's a war-weary American population. That said, there had not been a fatality, a casualty in Afghanistan in over a year prior to the withdrawal. And I think 2,500 folks over there would not have made a difference in terms of the Biden administration's new priorities. So I think it's unfortunate. I think he was trying to keep a campaign promise, is the short answer.
And, you know, what have you been hearing in terms of, is it a sign that the U.S. is less committed to its allies? How has it been interpreted?
Well, my fear is that that's how our allies will read it. Look, when you undertake an intervention like that, whether it's a physical intervention or an economic, your allies have to believe that when you're asking them to stand with you, that you're committed to your own strategy. And my fear is that what our allies and our enemies will take from this is that we become weary, that we will only stay true to our commitments as long as there's political support in the United States. And that's a bad message. It's much tougher to get your partners to stay with you or stand with you if they don't feel like they can rely on you and it's at the whim of American politics.
Interesting. And so how would you categorize foreign policy priorities today? Sort of generally, and then we're going to get into more specific areas around the world.
Sure. Well, the Biden administration has made very clear China is a huge priority for the president. Technology, certainly, cyber technology and enabling our innovation is a priority. I think that what you'll see is human rights, all those sorts of issues that haven't been at the forefront, certainly at the prior administration's foreign policy, will be at the forefront here. But the question is, you've got to be able to have your priorities, but keep all the other things moving, right? It's not a matter of making big choices in the diplomatic front. I always used to say there's the tyranny of the inbox. You come in with an agenda, and then everyday life interferes. And so I think that's what the administration is trying to cope with.
Okay, so I think next step in our conversation, that was sort of a broad commentary around foreign policy, is we're going to go around the world, and we're going to start an area that's kind of near and dear to Investcorp, which is the GCC. And I'm curious to hear, what kind of message do you think has been sent to the GCC countries with this withdrawal from Afghanistan?
So I think our partners in the GCC are concerned that this is a signal of a waning focus in terms of our partnerships there, and it questions the commitment of the United States to its partners in the Middle East. Look, I don't think there's any doubt that we will always have very important partnerships there for a whole bunch of reasons: regional stability, economics. We need our partners in the GCC. The question is, how much time and resources are we still willing to devote there? And I think that with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there's real concern throughout the GCC of, will we be there for those partners? And will the relationships there change with the new administration? Our GCC partners enjoyed a very close relationship with the Trump administration. And so I think they always viewed, no matter who got elected, that there was a risk to the strength of those relationships. But I think this is especially true. They're really uneasy until our partners in the GCC, until they see the Biden administration demonstrate its commitment to the region.
And coming from the Biden side, from a U.S. perspective, where do you see those relationships going policy-wise with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE? Will it be different now under the Biden administration?
I think it will be. I think that, let's start with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I think that they've made a very concerted decision to invest in trying to build that relationship. The Crown Prince enjoyed a very close relationship with the White House in the last administration. There's no expectation that he'll have that same relationship. But I think the Crown Prince and Saudi Arabia understood they were going to have to make real steps to try and build a relationship there. The Crown Prince could have released the female activist prior, because the Trump administration asked him to do it. They held that. They did that after Joe Biden's election. I think that was an olive branch. And so I think there's a very conscious, deliberate effort on the part of the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular to try and build that relationship and demonstrate whoever's in the White House, they know the partnership's important.
And we've also started to re-engage in talks with Iran. So where do you see that relationship going, U.S. relationship?
So I think this administration in particular, because President Biden, having been the vice president when the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, was cut with Iran in the Obama administration, our regional allies felt like that was done behind their backs and that the Obama administration had not been transparent with them. And so I think it's clear that the Biden administration would like to pursue a new Iran nuclear deal, but they're going to have to do it more transparently and with our partners in the GCC this time. And I think our GCC partners have made that clear to the new administration. That said, I think the American politics right now are going to make it more difficult, not less, for the Biden administration to get a nuclear deal that they can get through Congress. It's so divided right now. We have a lot of domestic issues. We have the budget issues, the infrastructure bill. And so for a lot of reasons, the congressional focus is on domestic policy, which makes it much harder for the White House to get through a very divisive foreign policy issue like the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah, certainly here in New York, we hear very little about it right now. If the media focus is not on it in any way, shape, and form, maybe it'll come back. Any other thoughts on the Middle East, that region, before we go to another region?
Look, I think while there are plenty of things to be critical of, we've seen extraordinary changes in Saudi Arabia. And I think what that will mean for them economically is extraordinarily important. More young people are staying there or returning after they get their education in Europe or the United States. It's a much more, you have a sense when you visit, the economy is a much more vibrant place. Many more young people are more engaged in economic development there. And I think that will make a huge difference, not just to the kingdom, but throughout the GCC. And I think that they're taking a larger role they see themselves as taking a larger role in regional affairs and world affairs.
Okay, so let's move to Europe. I'm going to start with the big question, which is generally, where does the relationship with Europe stand?
Well, if you'd asked me a week ago, I might have had a different answer. Look, Joe Biden has historically been an Atlanticist. He has often appeared at the Munich Security Conference. He talks about the importance of our allies in Europe and the importance of the strength of that relationship, the strength of NATO. I think both with the withdrawal of Afghanistan, which caught our allies, our European allies who were supporting us by surprise, and then this most recent tripartite deal with the Australians, which caught the French off guard, I think Europe is now questioning, is Joe Biden truly still an Atlanticist? Will he really give priority to Europe and strengthening that relationship? And I understand that.
And your view on what transpired in the last week with France?
So it's unclear why the administration would not have signaled this or in some way to our French allies. Look, there are huge defense contractors who will have an interest in in this particular project. As France has got a defense industry as well, that no doubt would have had a huge interest in participating. It's not clear what drove the secrecy of this. What is clear is having gone behind the French's back, all of our European allies will cringe. They will all question whether or not we're being forthcoming with them and straight. And this will have a long-lasting effect. I mean, I can tell you, having been in the Bush administration where they were very angry over Iraq, it's a long road back to establishing a good relationship with the French once you've lost their trust.
So the issue is as much the secrecy that happened as the actual contract that was signed as well, too.
I think that's right. Absolutely.
And other areas of Europe, the political situation in Germany, which is an important ally as well, too. Sometimes we forget there's a big election coming up there.
There's many foreign service officers and diplomats around the world, including the United States, that don't even remember a time without Angela Merkel. She's been an extraordinary leader for an incredible period of time, a period of various transitions. And she's done a remarkable job in terms of holding together German politics. Those are going to be very, very big shoes to fill, or as Madeleine Albright would say, big heels to fill. And so I think it's a very important change in not just for Germany, but for the European Union and for the bilateral relationship with the United States. I mean, we have a tremendous interest, both politically and economically, about how that turns out and ensuring the continued strong relationship between the US and Germany.
And UK, how's the political leadership doing? The relationship with the US right now? Obviously, have always been an important ally.
Very important ally. I think the deal with the French, including the UK, is a good signal that we're working very closely with them, that we consider that, it remains a very special relationship, different from any other of our European allies. And so, look, I think the relationship there, and I think there's a very decided effort on both sides of the pond, as we'd say, to continue that relationship and continue to strengthen it and do things together that we think benefit not just both countries, but the world.
And I'm going to bring up a quote, Donald Trump, that said he described NATO as obsolete. So more specifically, what do you think the future of the organization is post-Afghanistan and the nature of that relationship going forward with the US?
NATO is an incredibly important player. I think people will remember going back to 9/11, where we started this conversation. It is the first and only time that NATO invoked Article 5, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. And while President Trump was very critical, and I think NATO felt the sting of his criticism, what that resulted in was almost all the NATO countries beginning to increase their defense spending and meet their financial commitments to NATO. And so in some ways, NATO is stronger than it ever was. Joe Biden is an absolute advocate of NATO. And frankly, I don't think there's been in decades a more important time. We see a more resurgent, aggressive Russia, particularly in Eastern Europe, in the cyber realm, and in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so I think NATO has never been more important. America's role with NATO is important. And so I actually think this is an opportunity for NATO to reassert itself, to reestablish itself, because it is important.
You mentioned Russia. Give us a little color on their global role today, their global ambitions, and how the US sort of sees the relationship with Russia going forward.
So look, there's no talking about the US-Russia relationship without talking about political interference. I don't think there's anyone who's gotten over the notion that Russia hasn't interfered in our political process. And by the way, it's not just the United States. We know with our European allies that Russia has been a spoiler, if you will, and interfered in European elections. And so Russia continues to sort of paint itself as a bad actor. Nothing is more transparent than sort of in the cyber realm, where they claim that these are third-party criminal actors that act from Russian sovereign soil, but they do little to interfere or disrupt that criminal activity. And frankly, we question whether or not there's coordination between the government and the criminal actors. Russia, this is why I say NATO's important, but Russia, that's a difficult relationship. It's not going to get any easier, and Russia, I think, knows it with Joe Biden. If anything, it's going to get more scratchy, more contentious. We're in a period where we've got the best we can hope for with Russia, I think, is to try and manage the relationship, to reduce the friction. But I don't think you're going to see a strengthening or, a reestablishment or a reset of the US-Russia relationship. I do think Russia tends to be a unifying force with our European allies.
And do you see Russia as more ambitious today to take on a global role as, say, 2 or 3 years ago?
It's interesting. Ambitious in a, I would say not in a political, in a geopolitical sense. Russia doesn't really assert itself that aggressively in a geopolitical sense, but it picks its spots. Russia will try to pick its allies, whether it's between India and Pakistan, and be a spoiler there. It will assert itself with China in terms of through Pakistan supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. And so they'll pick their spots where they want to be influential, where they want to make a just sort of a negative impact from our perspective. But I don't think that they're not taking, Putin hasn't taken the same role on the global stage as he has in the past. They seem to be taking more of a discrete and selective approach to where they want to play.
Okay, so as we go across Russia, you mentioned China earlier. So maybe we can talk about Asia a little bit. Henry Kissinger was always an advocate of mutual understanding between the US and China. Is that possible? What are the areas of common interest between the US and China?
So, we started with Afghanistan, and one of my concerns with China is that China will misread our withdrawal from Afghanistan. If China takes the wrong message from that we are withdrawing from the world, that we are less inclined to use military assets around the world, and they misread that, it could be a signal to them that this is the time to begin to interfere with Taiwan, for example, which would be a horrible message and would increase the likelihood of a conflict with the United States. And so I worry about that. China, as opposed to what you asked me about Russia, China really is beginning to step up to play not just a regional role, which it always has wanted to play a strong and been uncomfortable with the US role in the region. They're stepping up to play a much more global role. That signal began with President Xi's speech in Davos 2 years ago, and it's continued. The Belt and Road Initiative is all part of their stepping up. And most importantly, I think in terms of policy, they are very quietly stepping up to take a role in cyber and internet governance, global governance bodies. And we don't share the same views with China or the same values in terms of privacy and the importance of privacy as relates to the internet. And so China is moving on several fronts on the global stage to assert their influence and power.
So can the US, I'll use the word stop, whatever that means, stop China, and does it want to?
I'm of the view that they're a competitor, not they don't necessarily have to be an adversary. They will be our adversary where they must. We should compete where we can, where it is most important to us, and we should cooperate where we can. Now, global climate change, where Senator Kerry is the administration's envoy, is probably the place where we can begin the cooperation piece. But there were places where we thought we could add to that cooperation list. Terrorism, except there's been such human rights abuses as relates to the Uyghurs, who they have labeled as terrorists. It's more difficult to think that we can cooperate with them in the counterterrorism realm. Human rights is always been a sovereign issue for the Chinese. They don't want to talk about it. They won't countenance the criticism. And so that's a difficulty. Economics, it's a mixed bag on the economic front. The Chinese hold tremendous amounts of US debt. And we've seen with the large real estate firm and all the debt they held, the Chinese don't want to destabilize the world financial market. It's not in their interest. And so it's not in theirs, it's not in ours. I don't think you'll see them do that. But they will, in terms of assert themselves in areas like Belt and Road, where they can make investments and buy, frankly, political influence. And that's difficult for the United States. We have foreign corrupt practices, and we have all sorts of rules and regulations about how we interact financially around the world. And so, again, we don't share the same values with the Chinese. And I think that this is going to continue to be sort of a bumpy, scratchy relationship because it impacts on American politics. You know, for as scratchy and divisive as Washington is right now, it's interesting. The one issue on which many Democrats and Republicans agree is sort of this very harsh anti-China view. That's fine, but then they better have an agenda about, again, where will we compete, where are we adversaries, and where we can cooperate. And that they haven't come, there's no mutual agreement between Republicans and Democrats on that. And I think the administration is hoping to sort of harness that one area of bipartisanship and see if they can't come up with a common agenda.
Yeah, you referenced them holding US debt. I mean, the two economies are very intertwined. And so now you're layering this whole human rights and strained relationship on top of that. And as you mentioned, it's probably the number one foreign policy focus of the Biden administration. You know, it's not so easy to disengage, I'm assuming.
No, that's right. But look, the Chinese have signaled in a very sort of concerning way their willingness to, for the first time, cause some economic disengagement. You know, the US threatened that, the Trump administration threatened that, but we're now seeing the Chinese, through their Chinese regulators, doing that in terms of the listings of mega Chinese companies on US exchanges and rules and restrictions that have really sort of shaken US markets. And our judgments about where we should and can invest in Chinese companies. And so that remains to shake out at a time of economic concern in the US and the potential for rising inflation. And so these two economic issues are coming to be at the same time, which causes real concern and questions of stability in the economic relationship.
Other observations on Asia?
So I think that we have to, on the positive news front, right? You see a Vietnam with a rising, very vibrant economy. Let's not forget Indonesia, which has a huge consumer market for us. And so there's lots of bright spots, but the US has got to remain engaged. And this is an area where we have competitive relationships with China. But we can't pull back from that. When we think of China, it's not just a bilateral relationship. For the US, we have to look at it as a regional relationship where we must maintain our influence with our other Asia allies. And we have very good relationships there, but it requires time and investment.
And so Middle East, Europe, Asia, if you're projecting out now in terms of foreign policy emphasis for the Biden administration, at least in their first term, where do those regions fit in terms of priority in your view? And how does that differ from the priorities historically?
So no question, the administration has made very clear Asia is the priority. I mean, frankly, the current administration used that as one of the reasons for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think that's silly, right? 2,500 of our troops were not going to make a difference in terms of the administration's global priorities. But Asia and China are a real focus, both because of the domestic impact and the importance in the global geopolitical scheme of things. And that's where you will see, I think, the biggest focus. Europe is now going to require much more time and attention and nurturing. I think there's a lot of repair work that's got to be done there because, as I say, the damage is not just, I mean, we're dealing immediately with the US-French bilateral relationship, but all of our EU partners have been shaken by what happened. And so I think both with our UK and the UK and the US are going to have to work together to repair the relationships across Europe. The Middle East, I think they're going to view as they want to keep it simmering. They want nothing bad or no conflicts to break out there because they don't want their attention to be drawn. They've seen prior administrations There was the infamous during the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton's pivot to China that never happened because they were caught paying attention to the Middle East. Certainly true of the Bush administration. The Trump administration intended to spend more time and attention on China. And so I think, again, we come back to this tyranny of the inbox. You come in with priorities, but you have to deal with sort of emergencies and tragedies and catastrophes. And so we'll see. I do think you'll see them more attention paid. Asia will be a priority. But I think the hope is that there will be greater stability in the Middle East requiring less US attention.
And so before we move, we're going to move to some more domestic questions as well, too, for the US. I wanted to ask a question about a projection, right, which is maybe not fair, but let's see where this goes. So in 10 years, who's up and who's down in terms of these superpowers? And again, you define superpowers. There's no definition. You'll define it.
Okay, 10 years is, as you know, John, like lifetimes in the foreign policy world, because it's difficult to answer that not knowing what conflicts break out, what the economic landscape looks like. No one should count out the United States. The United States will remain a superpower. I think what we're struggling now is in a post-World War II environment. We helped create the global governance system. And now we're struggling with what is our role in the world post-World War II in this new environment, in an environment with new technology. I think China will remain, you're going to continue to see the rise of China, and they will be, as I say, what you hope is you can get to a point where they are peer competitors, but not adversaries, and managing our way to that with the Chinese, right? And that's a matter of, we're going to have to begin to work on how can we establish greater trust with the Chinese so that we're both comfortable being competitors without it tipping into being adversaries. I don't see, when we think of 10 years from now, I do not see, frankly, based on the economics and the politics of it, a resurgent Russia. I think Russia is economically weak. It's politically weak. I think Putin's, endless reign there does not help Russia. And so I don't think Russia can retake a prominent place on the world stage in a positive way until we move post-Putin. And we ought to expect we're going to continue to see them being a sort of disruptive force as long as he's there. John, it occurs to me when we spoke about the Middle East, there's one country I didn't speak of that bears mentioning, and that's Yemen. When you think of the humanitarian tragedy that's been there, and I've traveled during the war between Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan. I've been to Yemen, I think twice, maybe 3 times. It's a wonderful people. It's not a big economic player. And so I think for that reason, the world hasn't paid much attention to Yemen. And it doesn't even get sort of much attention in the region because it's not a big economic player. This is sort of viewed as a Saudi Yemen issue. And that's unfortunate because what's really going on there is what happened in Vietnam, in the sense of Yemen became the battleground between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They got caught in the middle, just as the Vietnamese got caught between the Russians and the United States. And it's played on for so long, I think the geopolitics, people have forgotten about it. And that's unfortunate. I think everybody's ready to resolve that issue. And if the US could play a peacemaking role, a better peacemaking role, along with the UN envoy, it would be good for everybody. This has been a distraction for the Saudis. It's been a drain on sort of attention and resources. And so I think we ought to hope that there's the potential to see during the Biden administration a resolution of the conflict in Yemen.
So before we actually get to the US, now that you started talking about Yemen, I was going to ask about two other regions and some of your thoughts related to that. And I'll make them broad regions, and the two regions are Africa and South America. Any sort of thoughts, foreign policy wise, as to what's going on there? Has anything surprised you?
So with South America, we in the United States, they're an important economic player. Think back to NAFTA, right, with Mexico and the US and Canada. South America is an important player in the hemisphere for the United States, but doesn't get sort of the attention it needs. We will pick our places where we engage, mostly for economics, like Brazil. But we don't, in my judgment, give it the policy time and attention it deserves. Typically here in the United States, as you know, when we look south, we talk about immigration. And it's unfortunate, right? Because it's like a one issue region that deserves more than just a single issue, right? And the economics, it deserves more economic attention. I think it's the Biden administration's intention to try and strengthen our relationships there. But again, limited time, limited resources, big players on the international stage. They may find themselves exactly where all the prior Republican and Democratic administrations found themselves. And that is, you deal with it as you have to, but you have to devote your attention, your diplomatic attention, to the bigger players. Africa is incredibly important. So here's a perfect example. China has made extraordinary investments in Africa while our attention has been diverted. In the Bush administration, between PEPFAR, President Bush had built extraordinary relationships in Africa, both by our AIDS program, PEPFAR, real investments, our anti-malaria campaign of the First Lady. And we did that. It did enormous good. You'd visit African countries. There were streets named after President Bush, and you could see the benefit of that investment. You haven't seen that since the Bush administration, and that's too much time. And that gap of attention is where the Chinese came in and made real investments and real headway there. And I think we're going to pay a price for that. I think we do have to understand. Look at the population there and the potential economics there. And so I think we've taken our eye off the Africa ball and going to have to reinvest there.
And given China's investment there for projecting 10 years out, sounds like that'll be an important part of the potential rise for China as a superpower as well, too.
Positively.
So I'm going to move a bit to domestic. That was actually terrific, Frances. Thank you. The present administration, general question to start. Mm-hmm. How do you feel diplomatically, and you've referenced this a few times in the 40 minutes we've been talking, conducting themselves, and where in their prioritization does the domestic economy fit relative to foreign policy initiatives?
I'd frankly say that they're spending much more time and attention on the domestic issues than the foreign policy issues right now. The infrastructure bill, you think about the COVID relief bills that have passed and pumped cash into the economy to help people during this very difficult time. The infrastructure bill is meant to be another economic stimulus, frankly, much needed and important, but again, caught up in the politics of it. Immigration, they're having to spend, the numbers of illegal crossings on our southern border are higher than ever. We heard much more about this during the Trump administration, but they're struggling to deal with that issue. And so the president is torn, his own party is torn somewhat, because you have sort of the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez way left of the party. And the president is a more bipartisan, middle of the road policy-wise. And so he's getting a lot of pressure just from his own party. So I think what you're going to see is he spends a lot more time. There's a real worry about inflation. The talk is will he reappoint Jay Powell to the Fed, managing interest rates. We saw just this week in the US economy, we've had a very frothy, hot stock market, that one piece of bad news or potential bad news out of China sent us skittering for 48 hours. I think that's a real sign that while the markets have been very frothy and very strong, there's an underlying concern about long-term stability and the ability to sustain those markets.
Yeah, back to that intertwining with China. There are a number of articles today, major debt funds in the United States that are managing money for pension funds and the like in the United States have excessive exposure to Evergrande and some of these Chinese property companies. So, as we were talking about earlier, I mean, they're going to have to find a way to work together.
Right.
Let's go to security for a minute, something that you know quite well. So what do you see the biggest security challenges for the United States? Is it domestic or foreign actors pose the greater threat? So
again, this is a perfect dichotomy. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, it would have been a very easy answer. The foreign threats, state actors and non-state actors, the foreign threat is the primary focus. And if you told me that you'd have to devote substantial resources to domestic terrorism, I would have questioned that, right? We did have, there were, make no mistake, there were domestic terrorism, left-wing environmental groups, and so they were domestic terrorism, but it was not a serious concern. It began to evolve from the foreign threat to what we called homegrown actors, because we made it more difficult for foreign actors to cross the border, bad guys to cross the border. They began to recruit and train people inside the United States, but that was really still a foreign threat, a foreign actor looking for a way around our security architecture. Now, post January 6th, we have real domestic terrorism problems that require real attention, real investigative and intelligence resources. And that's a difficult challenge for us. We have a constitution, we care about our freedoms and our liberties. Attacking that problem, moving resources from the foreign threat to the domestic threat, the tools and capabilities are different. The legal structure is very different, and rightly so. And so I think this administration is going to be forced to fight on two fronts in terms of the security threats in a way that it just wasn't the same when I was in government. I think this represents a real challenge for them because there's a political dimension to domestic terrorism I would never have anticipated that I did not have to deal with mostly on the foreign side. The foreign threat is a unifying American force because everybody wants to make America more secure from foreign threats. The domestic threat, when you layer the politics over it, becomes much more challenging.
I'm going to put that in the inbox as well too. So
that
wasn't in the inbox 10 years ago. So now that's another priority. You referenced cybersecurity over the course of our talk and the ransomware attacks we've seen. So tell us, how prepared is the US for those types of attacks? How's the infrastructure? Do we have the safeguards to block against these serious attacks? Are we behind the curve?
So the US has got probably the greatest cyber capability in the world. Let's just start with what's our capability, both offensive and defensive. There are few peer competitors, China, Russia, Iran, Israel. I'd put that they're not us, but they would be the next layer down in terms of peer competitors. And I've put in there real competitors, real adversaries. And so we ought to be concerned about it. I share Leon Panetta's view that if you asked me what the next 9/11 looked like, it would be, we thought we would get another physical attack by sort of both the grace of God and the investment of the intelligence and law enforcement communities. We didn't have another huge physical attack on US soil. But if we were to have another 9/11, it would be, I think, a cyber attack that was either entirely cyber or a hybrid cyber and physical attack that used both. And I worry about it enormously. I don't think we're sufficiently prepared. We talk about this, people hear it, but it really requires intellectual and resource investment that we haven't done yet in the United States. And it sort of makes me cringe. You know, the 9/11 Commission said we lacked imagination, and therefore we're not prepared. And I feel that way in the cyber realm. We ought to be making greater investments. We ought to be giving it the sort of policy time and attention it requires. Every administration has given it policy time. Each administration is built on the last, Republican and Democrat, in this area. But our capabilities are scattered around the US government. Each agency competes for technology resources and personnel. And what we need is a much more national, all aspects of national power strategy that reinforces various capabilities and legal authorities, not having them compete inside the US government.
And to this point, although maybe talked about at some level, you haven't seen any movement forward in terms of that unifying approach to cybersecurity.
I would say that there have been steps, and I think that there have been sort of modest attempts at this. We have a cyber command, but we haven't done enough. And again, this is the tyranny of the inbox. People's intentions are good, but we just haven't made enough progress fast enough, and it's really concerning.
Yeah, what's really concerning is if something happens, that's when we'll actually react in a way that unifies and provides resources and makes it a higher priority as opposed to in advance of that type of thing. But I guess
you'd think we'd learned that from 9/11, right? There were commission reports about being more unified against terrorism before the 9/11 attack. And it's just so frustrating to me. We need to do that now as relates to cyber threats. And I just don't see enough progress.
Okay, so let's move to another topic that covers the entire world, technology. So we've certainly seen a trend from the US, from Europe. You referenced the trend in China, where governments, for lack of a better term, don't like big tech presently. Does this concern you? How does it impact the economy? And how does it impact, the world stage as well, too?
So we've seen a much more aggressive Justice Department. They just filed another big antitrust action this week. We see it, as you mentioned, as you alluded to, in China against big tech. I think we have to understand that as always, even if this was not about cyber, when we were talking about industry, regulation can be okay, can be necessary, can be required. We saw Sarbanes-Oxley after the financial crisis. So there some regulation, but regulators must understand the industry they're trying to regulate. They must understand globally what the regulatory scheme is, and they must act in a way that protects our ability to innovate and doesn't put us at a competitive disadvantage again vis-a-vis, let's say, China and technology. When you look at AI, for example, and nanotechnology, we're losing our competitive edge. And I think the regulators here and the legislators here have to be very careful, very conscious not to make our competition and innovation more difficult. We ought to be looking for ways to make it less difficult. The other area we've seen this in is in terms of global corporate tax rates, which we're talking about raising again. I understand sort of the domestic politics of this, but what we fail to do is explain to voters that these sort of corporate tax issues, these global corporate regulatory efforts do impact American pocketbooks if we can't be as innovative and competitive. And so this is another area where I think legislators have to educate themselves and take the time to educate themselves as opposed to just play domestic politics with these issues, which I find very dangerous.
It seems like in most of the world, up until maybe recently with China, for example, and Alibaba, these technology companies have gone relatively unregulated. And now I think people are starting to realize that the level of influence they have, the the positions they may take and how they may impact government. It's quite dramatic, and I think at least I'll be interested to see how they deal with that issue as well too. When you've been unregulated for a long time, and then suddenly people realize maybe there needs to be a greater level of regulation.
Absolutely. Look, you're 1,000% right, John. And I think companies, corporations, we've seen the rise of investor concern on ESG, right? Environment, sustainability, and governance. For this very reason, companies have to recognize that they have a responsibility and obligation to be good global citizens. If you're a multinational, you have to be a good global citizen, and you have responsibilities and obligations there that you must meet. And I think investors are requiring this now. Larry Fink wrote the letter that really started this trend, and he continues to write his annual letter. I do think that part of this is corporations not stepping up and recognizing their global corporate responsibilities and obligations that they're now going to be forced to.
And so you led me right into the environmental question, which is, what is the U.S., not private companies now, but the U.S.'s responsibility in helping to solve the global climate crisis situation that we have today? And then do you think the other companies and countries, big countries around the world, share the same view?
So President Biden made perfectly clear from the moment he took office that tackling global climate change was going to be a priority. And he did that when he appointed former Secretary of State John Kerry to lead the diplomatic effort. That was a signal to the world about just how high a priority this is for the administration. And it's important to note that he gave a single individual, not just the Secretary of State, the diplomatic responsibility, because he has a very good understanding of diplomacy. The Secretary of State's got a lot of things, Secretary Blinken, on his plate. But if you give this issue to one person where it's their full-time responsibility, it will get more consistent and persistent attention around the world. So I do think we have a responsibility. I don't think we've done enough. I think this administration is determined to change that. And it's an issue on which, to me, it's sort of, as we would say in the United States, a motherhood and apple pie. Who could be against it? Right. And so I do think, as I mentioned earlier, this is one where we can work with China and our other allies around the world. I think we can play a leadership role. I think there are people like Angela Merkel in Germany who have done very groundbreaking things in terms of their national governance on this issue to support the global effort against climate change. So I think this is an area where we ought to take the best practices that we found around the world. I would hope when Angela Merkel's out of office that John Kerry could work with her, because she's been incredibly thoughtful in this area, and that we could make a change. We can make changes and make progress. We absolutely have to. And so I think the US has got a leadership role to play here.
In Asia, which is a huge growing area for the world economy, and therefore will also be very influential in this climate change discussion. Where do you see them generally as it relates to climate change? Coming along or still a little bit behind?
Look, I think they're a little bit behind, right? I think China understands sort of its problematic role here in terms of climate change and carbon. But they've been making trade-offs in terms of prioritizing the economy over climate change issues. And so I think, again, it's sort of with your rise in terms of the world stage comes responsibility. And so I think China is behind. I think China's got to make real commitments and keep to those real commitments. And I think it's an opportunity for China to play a leadership role in the region that they want to play. And so this is an issue that's an opportunity, I think, for China, as opposed to they can take to use the Chinese phrase, they can take the climate crisis and turn it into a regional opportunity for themselves.
And if they focus on that, another step forward in 10 years in terms of global superpower as well, too.
Absolutely.
So we're getting near the end. So I only have really one other question at this point, and then I'd like to hear any other closing thoughts that you might have. But before you do the closing thoughts, I'm going to make this a really broad question. What is the biggest threat that the U.S. is facing today?
Oh, it's hard, as you might imagine, very hard to pick one. I think it's different in different areas. In security, I'd say it's cyber. In terms of the geopolitics, I think it's how do we manage our relationship going forward with China. I think we cannot take our eye off the ball in the Middle East, or we will wind up, if we divert too much attention, there will be a stability problem there that's going to pull us back. And so I guess if you asked me in terms of security, it's cyber. In terms of geopolitics, it's probably China. But again, we can't take our eye off Russia. I think that's where I'd land in terms of the most important things. And then there's the economy, of course.
Yeah. So any other closing thoughts? Anything you want to share with the audience?
So I think the most disconcerting thing for people around the world is seeing the political division and instability in the US. I think the assault on the Capitol not only shook Americans, but I think it shook those around the world, both our allies and our enemies. It showed a surprising and not before sort of exposed vulnerability. You know, democracy and freedom is our great strength. But when someone takes that and uses it, weaponizes it, and uses it against the system, it's incredibly destabilizing. And so I think the president, the current administration's got to find a way to listen to, talk to, and address the concerns of its political adversaries. You know, 35 million people voted for President Trump. And if the Democratic Party doesn't like them, doesn't want to deal with them, that's a problem. Because the president is the president for all Americans, including those who didn't vote for him. And so I think that becomes not just a domestic issue, but a geopolitical issue, because I think the world is watching us and how we move forward and heal the wounds of January 6th. And I think we can't talk about all the issues we talked about without recognizing that.
Yeah. Again, another thing to be dealt with if 10 years down the road, you still want to be perceived as that global superpower.
Absolutely.
So I think we're coming to the end now. And I want to thank Frances and thank you for making a longtime real estate investor look decent as a moderator. I really appreciate that.
It's a great conversation. Thank you, John.
Yeah. And, you know, I know I'm going to go back and watch it this afternoon. I learned a lot in our session as well, too. So, you know, thank you for taking the time today.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who logged on to watch.